So welcome everybody to this third edition of Corpus Curiosum. As I said, I can see some known faces, but for sure we are now 162 people, so there are many people that are new. So I will do a bit of introduction for you to get to know us. So yeah. So first of all, we wanted to explain you where we got the inspiration of our name, Corpus Curiosum. Probably you already know it, but we got inspired by the Corpus Callosum, that is this part of the brain that is connecting both hemispheres in the brain. So in the same way that this part of the brain is connecting the two hemispheres, we wanted to connect early career neuroscientists all around the world, and that's why we called our project Corpus Curiosum. And now, who are behind the scenes? So this is us, Ines, that she's based in Madrid, Faisal, that he's based in London, and me, that I'm based in Zurich. So we are three early career neuroscientists at different stages of our career, and as you can see, also in different places. In this third edition, we are super lucky because we are not alone in the trip. We launched this ambassador program. So here you have all our ambassadors that help us reaching the voice, reaching all the countries where they come from. We have ambassadors from 14 different countries. So we thank all of you guys because this was super wonderful to work with you. We also have our sponsors. First of all, we have the International Brain Research Organization that we are super happy as well, because one of the main goals of this project is to promote the diversity in the field of neuroscience. And thanks to that, thanks to our efforts, we won a grant, the Diversity Grant. So we are super happy for that. We have, again, the support of the FENS in this edition, and for the first time, we also have the support of the ACCH. This association is an association of Spanish researchers in Switzerland, and they are super cool. So you guys, if you want to know more about them, you can reach them using the email that you have here, or you can also use the QR code that you have here to know more about them. And now a bit about our audience, about you guys. You come from 44 countries, which is a lot. And this is, again, thank you to our ambassadors. And you come also from more than 100 different institutions and companies. So this is amazing for us. And now, before we move to introduce our speaker, we wanted to share with you some important notes. First of all, you have to know that this introduction and also the main talk will be recorded, but you don't have to worry because you are not going to be recorded at any time. That means that at the end of the talk, when we do the discussion, the recording will be stopped. So please feel free to ask whatever you want. Regarding the questions and answers, you can use the chat of Zoom. You know that there is a chat. Here you can write down all your questions and Pascale will answer them at the end of the talk. Okay, so you have to know as well that this is a super safe space, so there are no silly questions. All the comments are super welcome. So we really encourage you guys to have a bit of discussion with the speaker. And finally, the length of this talk will be 1.5 hours. And that means that we will close the session at 4:30 p.m. UK time. But of course, you can leave whenever you want. Now, the most important part of this introduction. Here we have Dr. Pascale Tremblay. She is our speaker, and I will introduce a bit about her biography. So she is now a full professor in the rehabilitation department at the Université Laval in Quebec, where she teaches in the speech, language pathology, and audiology programs. Her laboratory, the Speech and Hearing Neuroscience Lab, is located at Cerveau Brain Research in the center of Quebec City. She studied linguistics, and then she did a PhD also in Montreal. And during her thesis, she was studying neuromotor control of speech production using different techniques. Then she fell in love with this topic, and she did other 2 postdocs in the same area. Nowadays, Dr. Tremblay aims to uncover the neurobiological mechanisms underlying the perception and production of speech and voice in adults, which are super important for building blocks of social interactions. And that's why the talk of today is called Broca and Wernicke are dead, or moving past the classic model of language and neurobiology. Okay, so now we can see what Pascale thinks about all of this topic. So if you want, Pascale, you can share your screen. I will stop mine. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Alba and Ines, for this great introduction and invitation. I'm very excited to be here today. It's great to see so many people from so many different countries. So something that we hardly can do in person. So that's a really, really, cool setup. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about Broca and Wernicke, as Alba mentioned. I'll begin with just a few words about what we do in my lab, just to set the stage a little bit more, and then I'll move on very quickly to the main topic. So in my lab, you see some of us here, we use magnetic resonance imaging to study the anatomy and the function of the human brain. We also use transcranial magnetic stimulation to modulate the functioning of the brain, and electroencephalography to capture the rhythms of the brain. And we use all of this information to try to understand the neurobiology of language, and especially speech perception and production. And we are interested in understanding how it works, how it changes with age, and with skill acquisition, such as like musical activities. So I'll begin this talk with some introductory remarks about the language system. Just so that we are a little bit on the same page for those less familiar with language research. Then I'll provide a little bit of an overview of the history of language neurobiology. And then I get into my main points, which are the criticisms of this classical Wernicke-Broca type model. I mean, I'll begin with something very general. Language is a very unique ability that distinguishes us from our ancestors, as well as from all other living organisms on Earth, as far as we know. Animals do communicate, but they don't communicate in a way that is as sophisticated as human language is. And this language that we have invented, these languages, I mean, the faculty of language, singular, but multiple languages, obviously. It's a very powerful human invention. It's what has allowed us to, collaborate among us. And through this collaboration, we have invented literature, medicine, technology, and we even went to the moon, and perhaps soon to Mars. So it's something very powerful, as led to multiple, other inventions. So I think sometimes it's not apparent that language is so complex because, the vast majority of human beings learn to speak. And they do seemingly naturally. You think about infants, how they pick up language from listening and from babbling. It seems like it's not requiring much effort, but it is. The fact that it looks natural doesn't mean it's not complex or difficult for the brain in the background. So I'm going to try to show you a little bit today of why it's complex and why actually the old model cannot capture that complexity, or does not capture that complexity. So a first layer of complexity is that language has two major components, right? One expressive component and one receptive component. And at both ends of this continuum, there are multiple steps that are involved to be able to communicate. From the expressive side, we need to be able to convert ideas or thoughts into words. And then we need to take those words, organize them, and then convert them into sound or phonological units. And these units then need to be converted into a code that the motor system can understand. So it's a stage of motor planning and programming. So you pick up the motor programs that you're going to use to talk, but then you need to adjust them to the context. For example, how loud do I need to talk today, or how fast? Am I angry? Because if so, then I'm going to speak louder. But if I'm happy, my voice is going to sound different. So all of this has to be planned. And to be able to talk, we need to coordinate multiple systems. We need the respiratory system that produce, the power to make the vocal fold enter into vibration that produce the voice. But the voice isn't speech itself, right? It needs to be modulated using what you see in the picture, the lips, the tongue, the soft palate, that will all move together to produce different configuration that will form all of the vowels and consonant of all of the language in this planet. So that's articulation. On the recepting side, things are not any less simple. You need to process this sound against oftentimes a background of noise. So it's a complex task. There's often people talking in the background or the dishwasher running. There's always noise in our, especially in our modern urban settings. But you also need to localize where the sound is coming from. And those are all auditory, central auditory processing tasks. And then you'll be processing the speech sounds that you hear, but they're fast. You know, there's no breaks in between them. So you need to segment the incoming signal. That's quite a challenge. You know, you piece that up into, you break it down into the syllables and the phonemes, and eventually you have access to the words. You'll activate a network of semantic representation distributed in the brain. Eventually that will lead to comprehension of what has been said. On the top of this, you have to process the face information. Though, you know, you might be thinking that you're not a good lip reader. I think that too, but I know that that's not true. And my brain can do stuff that I'm not aware of. And so we know that, you know, visual information, like the mouth moving, is processed and it's helpful. The voice of the talker is also processed. You can retrieve information such as identity, gender identity, emotion from the voice. So lots of information is processed too. On the top of this sort of language system is interacting at all time with cognitive and executive resources, because you know, you need short-term memory, access to long-term memory to express, you know, long-term memories. Attention, divided and sustain, you know, support speech and language function throughout the process. Another layer of complexity is that all of this is also influenced by other systems such as the emotion, the motivation, mood systems, because these systems and these will influence the words that we choose to express, the way that we express them. Like a voice is very affected by, for example, our emotional state. But also, you know, as you know, emotion will also impact the way that we even process language, right? The bias that we come with, that we have at any moment. So this is a complicated process. And what's important to understand is that it's fast. I mean, speech happens so quickly. So the brain works nonstop to process it, even though it does sound like right now, things are easy for you, you're only listening, but your brain is working hard. Another important aspect of language, I think worth mentioning, is precision. You know, we've all been amazed in our lives, I think, at the seemingly perfect control that dancers or athletes have over their bodies. I'll argue here that language is just as astonishing. To speak, we need to use over 100 muscles. It's a lot of muscles. They're located in your face, in your mouth, in your abdomen, and they coordinate to produce this extremely precise sensory motor acts. And in fact, speech is the fastest motor act in the human repertoire. So that makes it very special. So a typical adult can produce up to 14 sounds per second. That corresponds to 6 to 9 syllables per second. That's a lot of movements. That's very fast. To illustrate this point, I'll show you a little video I like to look at. So here you see, it's an image of a person talking. So it's a sagittal view, you know, cutting through the face. And then so you see the big structure here moving is the tongue. And what you see in the video at the bottom of the screen is the vowel that's being produced with each configuration. It's written in International Phonetic Alphabet. And for me, this is kind of like a choreography, and it's beautiful. And then you see that, you know, the tongue must be moving very precisely and synchronized with the lips and with the soft palate that you see here. So this is the soft palate, the tongue, the lips, the larynx. And each of these configurations, as I said, is associated in this picture with a vowel. The same is true for consonants. And so precision here is that, you know, a millimeter difference in the configuration of the tongue, for example, how the tongue tip will raise and touch the hard palate, you know, if it's a millimeter forward or backward, that will produce a different sound. So we're talking here about an infinite precision. If it's a different sound, then it's going to influence, you know, the word that's produced in your comprehension. So it's important. In addition to motor precision, you know, language is also precise and complex because we can express an infinite number of ideas in an infinite number of ways. That's what makes it so special among other communication systems. It's not, it's boundless. Okay, so that's it for my introduction to some basic concepts about language. As you can imagine, such a complex system is a challenge to represent, right? To modelize. So in the field of neurobiology, language neurobiology, which has been tackling this challenge, this you know, issue of language modeling has been at the center of everything. And but the story of this field is actually quite young. Up until the 18th century, scientists believed that the cerebral cortex was one big undifferentiated structure that was involved in all things that the humans can do, from talking to walking to breathing. One of the first scientists to question this notion was the German physician Franz Joseph Gall, you see here. And Gall proposed that, you know, the human cortex was differentiated and that different part of the brain had different function. You know, we all know phrenology, which is the resulting pseudoscience that came out of this idea. The part that was incorrect mostly was the fact that he thought that the skull was a representation of the brain configuration, which we know is wrong. But the idea of a differentiated cortical structure was correct, though it was abandoned and rejected by the scientific community at this time. Slowly in the 19th century, things started to change. The field of clinical neurology emerged slowly. So scientists began to study the brains of patients with neurological conditions. After their death, they would compare their symptoms to the structure of their brain. So Paul Broca was one such person. He's a French physician who first described a patient that was called Mr. Le Borgne. He was a man that was in his 30s and he was unable to speak any other word than tan. After his death, his brain revealed a lesion in the anterior part of the brain. And you can see here, what's fantastic is that the brain was preserved, and the team of Nina Drunkers in 2007 published some new images of those brains that we had never seen before. But you can see that the lesion was quite large. It wasn't a focal lesion. And then Broca described another patient that was called Mr. Leland, another man that was unable to speak, but he had normal comprehension and normal intelligence. And so Broca was one of the first to associate speech function to a part of the brain. So he said that the inferior part of the brain, the inferior frontal gyrus that we call it now, was involved in producing language. And he studied other cases that supported that claim. And another discovery that Paul Broca made that was also very important is that he was one of the first ones to talk about cerebral specialization. So we now call it cerebral, he talked it cerebral dominance. We now call it cerebral specialization. But basically what he noticed was that lesion to the left hemisphere tended to cause language pathologies, but not to the right. So he concluded the left hemisphere was dominant and that it was responsible for language. So some of these notions have been revised now, but we do know that the two hemispheres are not identical, right? So that was another very important discovery that he made. But the first model of language neurobiology dates from after Broca's discoveries. Several years after Broca's discovery, the German Karl Wernicke, who was also a physician, proposed a second language center. It was located in the temporal lobe, and it was related to language comprehension. Like Broca, he had observed patients with language dysfunctions, but in his case, the dysfunction were related to comprehension and not production of language. So based on all these observations and others, he proposed the very first language neurobiology model, which I'm showing here. It's a very simple model, but of course, I was a pioneer observation, a very, very important milestone in the history of neuroscience altogether. This model had an anterior frontal region for language production, a more posterior temporal region for language comprehension. The two were connected through the arcuate fasciculus, and they were also connected through the brainstem. In the 20th century, the American neurologist Norman Geschwin has repopularized and updated this model. In this form here that you can see, it's similar to the original Wernicke type model with, a posterior temporal region connected to an inferior frontal region, but there's also the addition of an inferior parietal region that he thought was related to converting visual information into sound. This slightly updated but simplistic model has been iconic. It became iconic. It became printed in textbooks in multiple fields like medicine, psychology, and linguistics, and it still is to this day, and not just for a historical perspective. It's become known across disciplines and even within the general public. It's kind of become the face of language neurobiology. Later in the 20th and the 21st century, brain imaging started. So that's when a lot of things started to change. It started with PET in the 1970s that allowed us to look for the first time inside a working human healthy brain, and then evolved with brain imaging, both structural at first and then functional in the 1990s. And these discoveries had a major impact on the field of language neurobiology, because that's when language neurobiology started to dissociate from clinical neurology to become a field of its own, a very interdisciplinary field where people from linguistic, neuroscience, neurology, speech-language pathology, psychology, and multiple other fields come together to study this so complex phenomenon that is language in all of its aspects. So of course, the discoveries accelerated, and there's a revolution in how we think about language. Though the vast majority of language neuroscientists do agree that the classical model is outdated, that's not something that's controversial in and of itself, but it's still being used despite that. In my view, it's no longer useful to do so. So I'm going to turn now to the pillars upon which that argument rests. There's three of them, basically. I'm going to talk about precision, I'm going to talk about modularity, and then I'm going to talk about simplicity. This is work that most of these ideas that I will discuss, this is work that I have done with my colleague, Professor Anthony Dick, who is at the Florida International University in the US, and that we have published in this paper that you see on the screen, as well as some other ideas in other related papers. So if you're interested, you have the references here. So I'll begin with precision. So the claim is that the term Broca and Wernicke's area are not sufficiently clearly defined, so ill-defined. Throughout the history, there's been an issue with the definition of Wernicke's area. That's the elephant in the room. In this figure that's adapted from a paper by Rauschiker and Scott, you can see that the definition from the definition proposed by Wernicke himself to other definition of other scientists throughout the years up until Geschwin has varied a lot. So there has never been an agreement in the history, at least up until Geschwin. So then when we came to this idea, we thought about, but perhaps things have changed. I mean, we didn't think so, but we wanted to, to verify if our impression was correct. So we did a survey. It's presented in this paper, and we asked researchers in the field of language neurobiology what corresponded to Wernicke's area to them, and we presented them with multiple definitions that you can see on the screen, and we asked them to simply tell us which one was the correct one. The results show that people don't agree. As you can see here, the responses are so distributed. Some people, very few people actually endorse Wernicke itself definition, but none of the definition has reached consensus anyway. We also did the same with Broca's area. Even though the definition is not as widely debated, it's not clear what Broca's area means. So we presented people with these definition of Broca's area, involving, parts of the IFG, the whole IFG, sometimes more than the IFG to include motor regions. As you can see, the situation is not as catastrophic as with Wernicke's area, but it is not good either, because there is no consensus. Although this part here that has both the opercular and the triangular part of the IFG reaches 49% of respondents. 49 isn't a majority, but it was still far from a consensus also for Broca. So why is it important? Well, I mean, we're scientists, right? So precision should not be debated, or it's important, period. But I'm still gonna give you more than that. So I'm gonna start with Broca. So this is the most commonly chosen definition. So it includes both the opercular and the triangular part of the IFG. So the triangular part corresponds to BA45. It's a granular region. So this is work. This figure is adapted from work by Michael Petridis at the MNI in Montreal. So he's shown that 45 is a granular area, most of the time associated with higher level lexical semantic processing. 44 is a dysgranular region, so it has a different architecture altogether. Different architecture usually mean different function, right? Different connectivity, different capacities for computing. So already here, you see that there's no reason to lump these together, because if you talk about 44, you're not talking about 45. They're not doing the same thing, most likely. So it's not useful to lump them together. But sometimes people even go further and include BA6 immediately posterior to them, which is the ventral premotor cortex. And the ventral premotor cortex is an agranular region. So it's a motor region. It has pyramidal neurons. It connects to the motor centers in the brainstem. It can control speech, but not IFG. So Broca's area, as it is usually thought about, is not a motor speech center. It's a region involved in language, but not a motor component. So I think this is part of an important part of this argument. For Wernicke areas, though the different definitions vary a lot, here you have a representation of broadband cortical fields, and each number represents a region, and each region means that the architecture is different. And so what you can see is that lumped together in this broad region are multiple BA, right? 40, 39, 41, 42, and 22. So this includes the inferior parietal lobule, the primary auditory cortex, associative auditory cortex, so multiple regions with multiple architecture, connectivity, and function. So again, I'm going to claim that this isn't helpful for advancing knowledge. In that paper, we looked at how those terms were used in the literature, and I just did a check to see if anything had changed in between now and the paper. And you see the use of Broca's areas continued to progress a little bit. So there's not been a drop lately in its use, and Wernicke's area has also been stably used. This is from PubMed in this paper that talk about Broca's area or Wernicke's area in the title or abstract. So most likely the paper's about them. So it's still very much used. The second issue is modularity. And I'm going to argue that the language system is not an encapsulated module. And I was glad to see in the survey that most of you think that way too. I'm going to use a quote from the American linguist Edward Sapir here, because it illustrates my point and it shows that this is not a new idea. Sapir in 1921 said that the speech system is an overlaid functional system which gets whatever service it can out of organs and function, nervous and muscular, that have come into being and are maintained for very different ends in its own. So the notion is here that language has evolved through evolution, from structures and processes already in place. So it didn't appear, right? So there's no reason to think of it as isolated because it built from other structure. And I'm going to show you that it still is using those that I'm going to call domain general systems or functions. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is from a book written by Frank Gunther, who's an American scientist specialized in the motor control of speech. And here is showing typical activation in the brain when people are talking. And here on the right, I'm showing a meta-analysis that we conducted, and that shows the typical region involved when people are using their hands, not talking. And I'm gonna just point out that there are multiple similarities. So both are using primary motor and premotor region, a medial premotor region like the SMA and a pre-SMA. The cerebellum, not shown in the figure, is also the brainstem and the thalamus. So there's a lot of overlap. So this means that the speech system does use general resources. And that makes sense, right? Because they were there before. And so, you know, we tweaked the system and then we made it capable of making us talk. But what's important to me is that these domain general resources need to be integrated in models, right? Even though they may not be specialized there, if they were not there, we wouldn't talk. So they're part of the system. This is a similar story for speech perception. It's actually kind of a nice study that we did when I was in Italy during my postdoc. We had people listen to speech and listen to birds. And just for your information, none of them spoke birds. So for them, you know, it didn't make sense, except that, you know, bird sounds are complex, just like speech is, but doesn't have meaning to us, most of us. And what I'm showing here in the figure, you see in black, it's the regions that were commonly involved in processing speech and the bird sounds. And it means that a big chunk of the speech processing pipeline isn't specialized. You know, it processes different types of sound. And yes, there had been studies before that showing that speech perception and tone perception were different. That's true, but tone is simple. You needed to compare speech to something that was just as complex, right? Like bird sounds. And we can talk about it more in a question if you have a question about the birds or this kind of stimuli. Recently we used TMS to try to get into this idea even more. So we inhibited the posterior part of the IFG and the anterior part of the supramarginal gyrus in the inferior parietal lobule, while people processed speech and bird sounds again. This is something we did here in Quebec City. And the idea was that if interference make people have difficulty processing just speech, then, you know, maybe we can say that those regions are specialized somehow. But if it interferes with the bird too, then, you know, we have to postulate something else going more general. And that's what happened. Our stimulation interfered with the processing of both the sounds, the speech sounds and the non-speech sounds alike. So I'm going to get into my third and last issue, which is the one of simplicity. You saw that the original model is quite simplistic, and that was only natural at this time. You know, it was only emerging, but we're years after that now. And you know that the language system is not simple. So we need a more complex models to represent it. You know, this is such a complex issue, simplicity, despite its name. So I'm not going to touch on all aspects. I'm just going to pick a few examples to make my case. And I'm going to start with speech because, you know, that's the part of the language that I study the most. So here you see images from a study published in my lab, and we had people, you know, young, healthy people just produce simple syllables without even meaning. And this is the brain activation that you get for this in the left hemisphere. So first remark is that it's extremely distributed, right? Just for producing simple syllables. But if I show you the right side too, then what are you going to say? Oh my God, this is not lateralized, right? This is almost identical on both sides. It's not identical, but it clearly involves both hemispheres. So it's bilateral. So it's distributed and bilateral. I'm just highlighting some of the parts where you see this bilaterality emerging. So models of language need to acknowledge that language is a bilateral function. Of course, it doesn't mean that the two hemispheres are doing the same thing, right? And it's still true that the left hemisphere seem to be doing or be more involved in specific function, but the two hemispheres are contributing. Though I'm showing something similar here for speech perception. Here you have the left hemisphere at the top, and at the bottom the right hemisphere. And people here, again, this is what we do in my lab. We usually focus at the syllable level. So we eliminate meaning. We just want to make it as simple as we can. And so people here are listening to syllables, meaningless syllables, and that's the activation that you get. So it's at first, again, it's quite distributed, and we're not even involving all components of language, and it's distributed again. Another important concepts that I think many of you are familiar with is the notion of overlap of functions, right? We used to envision the neural system as being extremely segregated. You know, you had the motor system, you had the sensory systems, but nowadays we have realized that there's a lot of overlap. That doesn't mean there's not a motor system, of course, but it's more like a sensory motor system. So here what I'm showing is taken from a study that we published a few years ago in the activations. All the region colored are those that were similarly active for perceiving and producing syllables. And to show that there's a huge overlap between the two functions. So we need to take this into account and think about what it means about function, what's happening in those regions that makes them contribute to both a motor and a perceptual process. So I have just two more examples of this issue of simplicity. So the first one is the subcortical component. So the classical model, even though actually Wernicke had the brainstem in his model, but that just didn't stick for some reason. There's been many iterations of this model, but quickly the brainstem component disappeared. And most models have been focused on the cortex. And of course, the cortex is immensely important, but it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg because there's a lot of other things going on. So this is a model that I drew for a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Neurolinguistics recently. And I was just trying to represent the way that I see the language systems, in a more holistic manner. And what you can see is that, of course, the several components that are numerous and they're not even all listed. But on the top of this, you have this connectivity with the cortical spinal, the cortical bulbar system. So with the brainstem and the cranial nerve nuclei, right? Because we need to talk through a motor system, right? So cortical regions interact together, they interact with the primary motor cortex you see here, and eventually this information is sent to the brainstem, the cranial nerve nuclei, to allow us to both speak and receive speech. But there's also interaction that we know of between the cortex, multiple region, and the basal ganglia through the thalamus, so cortical, subcortical loops. I mean, this is not a novel concept, right? Because we know that it's the case for any other motor system. You need this for infrastructure for walking and moving your hands, and you also need it to talk. So, but you also need those cortical, subcortical loops for multiple cognitive aspects of language, just as you need them for other cognitive functions. And there's also loops with, the cerebellum through the thalamus. It does seem to make sense, right? But it's not in most model of language. Sometimes it's in model of speech production, but models have been compartmentalized, right? So either they focus on the motor aspects or they focus on language. They rarely integrate all of it, which means that we don't have a full view of the system most of the time. So the last example I'll pick to illustrate this issues of simplicity with the classical model is that of the white matter. So 3 of the papers that we've written about this issue focused on this notion that the white matter scaffolding of the human language system is complex and includes so many more tracks than just the arcuate fasciculus. So here I show the tracks that we have discussed in those papers that are involved in this in the language system. So there's multiple ones of them. Of course, the arcuate is still there, but the arcuate fasciculus has remained important, of course, for language. But even now, we disagree about its architecture. There's been multiple models proposed. One of them that's been important is the Catani model, whereby the arcuate fasciculus wouldn't consist of 1 track, but actually 3 subtracks, 1 direct and 2 indirect track that you see in this graph here. But there's other models as well. So even the basic track, as we know it today, is more complex, but there's more tracks. One of the ones I like the most, because it's only been recently discovered, and it made so much sense to me when I first read about it, is the frontal ascent track. So it's illustrated here on this figure on the right side, and it connects the medial premotor region to the posterior IFG mainly. So it's a track that we think is involved in fluency and producing language, as well as multiple other cognitive function. It's definitely part of the language system. It probably isn't specialized for language, just like probably none of the track is. That doesn't mean it's not part of it, right? Because it's important for using language, communicating. Okay, so I'll end by restating that language. I think I hope I've shown it. It's quite a complex human ability, right? And because of this, the models that we use to represent it need to reflect this complexity. There's a lot of mysteries yet to be solved. So we need young researchers like you to try to tackle these questions. So it's a very important and unique field. What our argument is mainly is that maintaining an obsolete and simplistic model, it's not helpful for conducting research. The terminology is not precise. That impacts the results, right? Because if I'm saying I have a result in Broca's area, but for me Broca's area is 45 and for you it's 44, we're not even talking about the same thing, right? So it's difficult to put this together and understand what's happening. It has also influenced a lot the kind of hypotheses that have been researched, right? Because if you envision the language system as a cortical-based only system, special and encapsulated, you're going to study things related to this, right? So that has left many components of the language system understudied because they're sort of like nowhere to be found. It's also a model that's misleading to the non-experts. So people see the system and they think, oh, well, we know it, we have to know about language, but that's so not true. It's not true neurobiologically, and that's reflected in the fact that we have no cure for most language disorders today because we don't understand all of their ramifications. So if we don't understand the system, we don't understand how the system dysfunction in these pathologies, right? So, we need to have research, basic research in this area. And for this, we need to show people that, there's things to be discovered. And so this model for this purpose is also, in my opinion, not helpful. So my final statement would just be that we need to move on to a new neurobiology of language that more fully acknowledge these complexities as a whole, a distributed architecture, a bilateral feature, subcortical component, overlap of function, and a better defined terminology. So I'll thank you all for your attention.